April 27, 1945. A man who once commanded the loyalty of millions found himself hiding in the back of a German truck, wearing an oversized Wehrmacht coat and helmet, desperately trying to escape across the Swiss border. Just hours earlier, he had been the dictator of Italy. Now, he was a fugitive whose fate hung by the thinnest of threads. This is the story of Benito Mussolini's final 24 hours, a dramatic collapse that would end not with the pomp and ceremony he had always craved, but in a small village square, witnessed by ordinary Italians who had suffered under his rule for over 2 decades. The events that unfolded between the morning of April 27th and the afternoon of April 28, 1945, represent one of the most dramatic endings to any dictator's reign in modern history. What happened in those crucial hours would forever change how the world remembered Il Duce. The morning of April 27, 1945, found Benito Mussolini in the small town of Como, near the Swiss border. The once mighty dictator was now part of a German convoy attempting to flee to neutral Switzerland. Allied forces were closing in from the south. Milan had fallen just days earlier. For Mussolini, this represented his final chance at survival. Just 3 weeks prior, Mussolini had been meeting with German officials at his headquarters in Gargnano, still maintaining the illusion that the Italian Social Republic could survive the Allied advance. The puppet state he had established in northern Italy after his rescue by German paratroopers in 1943 was crumbling faster than anyone had anticipated. The Gothic line had been breached, German forces were in full retreat, and partisan activity had reached unprecedented levels throughout the region. The convoy that morning consisted of several vehicles carrying German officials, Italian fascist leaders, and their families. The composition revealed the desperation of the situation. High-ranking SS officers traveled alongside Italian ministers who had remained loyal to Mussolini's republic. Their wives clutched jewelry and personal documents that represented their only remaining wealth. Children peered nervously from vehicle windows, confused by the urgency and fear they sensed in the adults around them. Mussolini had abandoned his characteristic military uniform for a German greatcoat and steel helmet, hoping the disguise would allow him to pass unnoticed through partisan checkpoints that were becoming increasingly common along the escape roads. The transformation was both practical and symbolic. The man who had spent decades crafting his image as Il Duce, who had posed for countless photographs in elaborate uniforms designed to project strength and authority, was now hiding his identity beneath the insignia of his German allies. The irony was unmistakable. The man who had once strutted across balconies, declaring Italy's imperial destiny to roaring crowds in the Piazza Venezia, was now hunched in the back of a military truck, his face hidden beneath foreign insignia. His mistress, Clara Petacci, traveled separately with other Italian refugees, adding another layer of complexity to an already desperate situation. She had refused multiple opportunities to flee independently, insisting on sharing whatever fate awaited the man she had loved for over a decade. The route they had chosen followed the western shore of Lake Como, a path that had been used by countless refugees fleeing the advancing Allied forces. The lake, which had once hosted elegant vacation villas for Italy's elite, now served as a corridor for the desperate and defeated. Ancient towns that had witnessed centuries of Italian history were about to witness the final chapter of one of the most tumultuous periods in the nation's existence. As the convoy made its way north through the mountainous terrain near Lake Como, the situation grew more precarious by the hour. Reports reached them of partisan roadblocks ahead. Rumors spread that the Swiss border guards were no longer allowing Italian refugees to cross. The neutral country, which had maintained its independence throughout the war, was now overwhelmed with fleeing fascists and German officials seeking sanctuary. Swiss authorities had begun turning away all but the most essential personnel, and Mussolini's name was certainly not on any list of welcome refugees. The noose was tightening, and everyone in the convoy understood that capture meant almost certain death. The partisan movement had made it clear through leaflets and radio broadcasts that fascist leaders would face immediate justice if captured. There would be no prisoner exchanges, no negotiations, and no mercy for those who had collaborated with the German occupation or participated in the brutal suppression of the Italian resistance. The German officers leading the convoy were primarily concerned with their own survival. They had little loyalty to Mussolini at this point, viewing him more as a liability than an asset. Some whispered among themselves about abandoning the former dictator entirely, if it meant saving their own lives. The Third Reich was collapsing. Hitler was trapped in his Berlin bunker, and these officers understood that their primary obligation was to themselves and their families, not to their Italian allies. Colonel Hans Fallmeyer, the German officer in command of the convoy, had already made contingency plans for such a scenario. If forced to choose between his own men and the Italian refugees, he would not hesitate to sacrifice the latter. This calculation reflected the broader breakdown of the Axis alliance in its final weeks. Partnerships that had seemed unshakable just months earlier dissolved into mutual suspicion and self-interest when survival was at stake. But it was too late for such calculations. By midday on April 27th, the convoy encountered its first major obstacle, a partisan checkpoint near the village of Musso. The tension in the air was palpable as armed resistance fighters approached the vehicles, their eyes scanning each occupant with suspicious intensity. These were not regular soldiers, but local men and women who had intimate knowledge of the region and its inhabitants. They could spot irregularities that might escape the notice of conventional military personnel. The checkpoint had been established just hours earlier, based on intelligence reports that high-value targets were attempting to flee through this particular route. The partisans manning it had been specifically briefed to watch for disguised fascist officials and to conduct thorough inspections of all vehicles claiming German military status. What would happen next would set in motion the final, irreversible sequence of events that would end Mussolini's life within the next 24 hours. The partisan checkpoint near Musso was manned by members of the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade, a communist resistance unit that had been operating in the region for months. These were not professional soldiers, but ordinary Italians who had taken up arms against fascism. Farmers, factory workers, students, united by their hatred of the regime that had brought such suffering to their country. The brigade had been named after Giuseppe Garibaldi, the 19th century hero who had fought for Italian unification. Its members saw themselves as continuing his tradition of liberating Italy from foreign domination. Many had lost family members to fascist violence. Others had been imprisoned or tortured by Mussolini's secret police, and all carried personal grudges against the regime they were now helping to destroy. When the German convoy approached, the partisans initially prepared to wave it through. German military vehicles were still common along these routes, and the resistance fighters were more interested in capturing Italian fascists than detaining fleeing Wehrmacht personnel. However, something about this particular convoy aroused suspicion. One of the partisan leaders, a man named Urbano Lazzaro, noticed that several of the supposed German soldiers seemed nervous in a way that didn't match typical Wehrmacht behavior. Their uniforms didn't fit properly, and some appeared to be sweating despite the cool mountain air. Lazzaro had served briefly in the Italian army before joining the resistance, and his military experience gave him an eye for details that might escape civilian fighters. The partisan commander had received specific intelligence just hours earlier about high-value targets attempting to flee through this route. Radio communications from other resistance units had reported suspicious German convoys throughout the region, and partisan headquarters had issued orders to conduct thorough inspections of all military vehicles, regardless of their apparent nationality or authorization. Lazzaro ordered a more thorough inspection of the vehicles, a decision that would change the course of Italian history. His men approached each truck with weapons ready, demanding to see identification papers and asking pointed questions in both Italian and German. The genuine German officers responded with typical military efficiency, producing proper documentation and answering questions with practiced authority. But the disguised Italians struggled to maintain their charade under close scrutiny. As the partisans began checking documents and examining faces more closely, the tension became unbearable. The German officers maintained their composure, understanding that their survival depended on preserving the illusion that this was a routine military evacuation. However, they could do nothing to help their Italian passengers maintain their disguises without compromising their own safety. Some of the hidden fascist officials had forgotten to remove Italian military insignia from beneath their German coats. Others couldn't speak German well enough to pass even cursory questioning, and their accents immediately identified them as Italian, despite their Wehrmacht uniform. One man's hands shook so violently when asked to produce his papers that the documents scattered on the ground, revealing Italian identity cards mixed among the German military credentials. The most damaging evidence came when one of the partisans recognized a minor fascist official who had participated in brutal reprisals against civilian populations in the region. The man had tried to hide his distinctive facial scar beneath bandages, claiming a recent war wound. But his eyes and voice were unmistakable to someone who had witnessed his crimes firsthand. It was during this escalating inspection that one of the partisans recognized a face that had been plastered on propaganda posters throughout Italy for over 20 years. Despite the oversized helmet and the hunched posture, the distinctive jaw and the penetrating eyes were unmistakable. The partisan whispered urgently to his comrades, and within moments, the entire checkpoint buzzed with electric tension as the incredible realization spread through the resistance fighters. Giuseppe Negri, a young partisan who had grown up seeing Mussolini's image in every classroom and public building, was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. His whispered identification of Il Duce sent shockwaves through the checkpoint as fighters who had dreamed of this moment for years suddenly found themselves face to face with their greatest enemy. Mussolini, realizing his disguise had failed, attempted one final gambit. He straightened his shoulders and tried to assume the authoritative bearing that had once commanded respect and fear throughout Italy. For a moment, he attempted to project the same presence that had mesmerized crowds from palace balconies and dominated international conferences where he had negotiated with world leaders as an equal. The magic was gone. The context had changed completely. And the same gestures that had once inspired awe now appeared pathetic and desperate. Instead of the imposing figure who had mesmerized crowds from palace balconies, the partisans saw only a frightened old man in an ill-fitting coat, trying unsuccessfully to reclaim an authority that no longer existed. The capture was swift and decisive. The partisans surrounded the vehicle and ordered everyone out, their weapons trained on the occupants who had suddenly become the most valuable prisoners in northern Italy. The German officers were separated from the Italians, and the convoy's true nature became clear. This wasn't just a military retreat. It was an escape attempt by some of the most wanted war criminals in Italy. Colonel Fallmeyer, the German officer in command, immediately distanced himself from the Italian passengers, producing documentation that proved his unit's legitimate military status, and emphasizing that they had only provided transportation as a humanitarian gesture. His quick abandonment of his former allies demonstrated the complete breakdown of Axis solidarity in the war's final phase. Clara Petacci, who had been traveling in a different vehicle, was also identified and detained when the partisans conducted a complete search of the convoy. Her presence confirmed what the partisans had suspected. They had captured not just any fleeing fascist, but the former dictator himself, along with his inner circle and the woman who had shared his final years in power. The news of Mussolini's capture spread like wildfire through the partisan communication network. Within hours, resistance leaders throughout northern Italy knew that Il Duce was finally in their hands. Radio operators transmitted coded messages to partisan headquarters, while runners carried word to isolated resistance units that had been fighting in the mountains for months without any hope of achieving such a momentous victory. The psychological impact of the capture extended far beyond its immediate military significance. For partisan fighters who had risked their lives for months or years, often suffering terrible losses and setbacks, the seizure of Mussolini represented validation of their entire struggle. The man who had seemed almost superhuman in his ability to survive political crises and military disasters was now their prisoner, proving that even the most powerful dictators were ultimately vulnerable to popular resistance. But the capture also presented immediate practical problems. The partisans now possessed the most wanted man in Italy, and they faced urgent decisions about what to do with him in a rapidly changing military situation. As darkness fell on April 27th, Mussolini found himself imprisoned in a small farmhouse in the village of Bonzanigo. The building was modest and cramped, a stark contrast to the palaces and grand residences he had occupied during his years in power. The Villa Torlonia in Rome, where he had lived as prime minister, seemed like a different world compared to this simple peasant dwelling, with its rough stone walls and basic furnishings. The partisans had chosen this location carefully. It was remote enough to avoid unwanted attention from any remaining fascist sympathizers or German patrols, yet close enough to their command structure for quick communication. The farmhouse belonged to a local family that had suffered under fascist policies, making them reliable allies in guarding their most important prisoner. The man who had once controlled the fate of millions now faced the most powerless night of his life. He was confined to a small room with Clara Petacci, guarded by armed partisans who viewed him not as a former head of state, but as a war criminal responsible for countless deaths and immeasurable suffering. The guards rotated throughout the night, ensuring that someone was always watching their prisoners with loaded weapons and unwavering attention. Throughout that long night, Mussolini's behavior alternated between desperate attempts at dignity and moments of visible terror. The psychological transformation was remarkable to witness. The man who had dominated European politics for over 2 decades, who had negotiated with Hitler as an equal and commanded the loyalty of millions, now paced nervously in a cramped farmhouse room, his fate entirely in the hands of farmers and factory workers he had once dismissed as insignificant masses. He tried to engage his captors in conversation, sometimes appealing to their sense of Italian nationalism, reminding them of the territorial gains Italy had achieved under his leadership and the infrastructure projects that had modernized the country. At other times, he attempted to negotiate for his life, offering information about hidden fascist gold reserves and promising to reveal the locations of other fleeing officials if they would guarantee his safety. The partisans, however, remained unmoved by his pleas. They had seen too much of war's horror to be swayed by the rhetoric of the man they held responsible for Italy's involvement in the conflict. Many had lost family members in the war. Others had witnessed brutal reprisals against civilian populations, and all carried memories of the repression and violence that had characterized fascist rule. Clara Petacci's presence added another dimension to the already tense situation. She had chosen to remain with Mussolini despite numerous opportunities to flee separately. And now she faced the same uncertain fate. Her loyalty was both touching and tragic. A woman who could have escaped to safety, but chose instead to share whatever destiny awaited her lover. The partisans debated among themselves what to do with her, recognizing that she was not a political leader, but understanding that her association with the dictator made her a symbol of the regime they had fought to overthrow. Some argued that she was merely a victim of circumstance, caught up in events beyond her control. Others insisted that her years as Mussolini's companion made her complicit in his crimes, if not through direct action, then through her symbolic support of his regime. Throughout the night, Petacci tried to comfort Mussolini while struggling with her own fear. She had lived a life of luxury and privilege as the dictator's mistress, attending elaborate social functions and enjoying the protection that came with her position. Now, in this humble farmhouse, she faced the reality that her association with power had made her a target for those seeking justice. Meanwhile, urgent communications flowed between partisan commanders throughout the region. The capture of Mussolini presented both an opportunity and a problem of unprecedented magnitude. They had achieved what many thought impossible, capturing alive the man who had led Italy into its darkest chapter. But now they faced the question of what to do with him. And the decision would have implications far beyond their immediate military situation. Some partisan leaders argued for a public trial, believing that Mussolini should face justice in a court of law where his crimes could be fully exposed and documented for history. This approach would provide legitimacy to their cause and demonstrate that the resistance movement operated according to legal and moral principles rather than simple revenge. Others insisted that the situation was too volatile for such proceedings, arguing that any delay risked either his rescue by remaining fascist forces or his liberation by advancing Allied troops, who might prefer to handle his fate through international tribunals. The practical military situation demanded quick action rather than lengthy legal processes. The debate revealed deeper tensions within the resistance movement about the nature of justice and the future of Italy. Communist partisans tended to favor immediate revolutionary justice, viewing Mussolini's execution as necessary to prevent any possibility of his return to power. Liberal and moderate resistance fighters were more inclined toward legal proceedings that would establish precedents for the democratic Italy they hoped to build. As the night wore on, reports reached the partisan leadership that other high-ranking fascist officials had been captured at various points along the escape route. The entire upper echelon of the Italian Social Republic appeared to be falling into resistance hands, creating additional pressure to reach quick decisions about their fate. Each passing hour increased the risk that Allied forces would arrive and demand custody of the prisoners. Alessandro Pavolini, the fanatical fascist leader who had helped organize the Italian Social Republic, had been captured near Bergamo. Achille Staras, the former secretary of the National Fascist Party, known for his brutal enforcement of fascist ideology, was in partisan hands near Como. The resistance had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, sweeping up not just Mussolini, but virtually his entire remaining government. The former dictator seemed to sense that his time was running out as dawn approached. According to the partisans who guarded him that night, he spoke frequently about his legacy, sometimes with defiance, insisting that history would vindicate his attempts to restore Italy's greatness. At other times, he displayed something approaching regret, particularly when discussing the human cost of the war and the suffering it had brought to the Italian people. He mentioned his children repeatedly, expressing concern about their safety and their future in a post-fascist Italy. His eldest son, Vittorio, had been a prominent figure in fascist cinema and propaganda. His daughter, Edda, had married Galeazzo Ciano, the foreign minister who had eventually turned against his father-in-law and been executed for treason. The personal toll of his political choices seemed to weigh heavily on him in those final hours. Mussolini also reflected on his relationship with Hitler and Nazi Germany. sometimes expressing frustration with his German allies and their treatment of Italy as a junior partner in the Axis alliance. He seemed to understand that his decision to align Italy with Nazi Germany had been a fatal mistake that had ultimately led to his current predicament. But as dawn approached on April 28th, it became clear that philosophical reflections on his legacy would be irrelevant. The partisan leadership had reached a decision during their night-long deliberations that would seal his fate within hours. The debate was over, and the final act of Mussolini's life was about to begin. Dawn on April 28th brought with it a finality that everyone involved seemed to sense. The partisan commanders had spent the night in urgent consultation, and by morning, their decision was made. There would be no lengthy trial, no transfer to Allied custody, and no opportunity for Mussolini to become a rallying point for remaining fascist sympathizers. The man tasked with carrying out this decision was Walter Audisio, a communist partisan commander known by his nom de guerre, Colonel Valerio. Audisio had fought against fascism since the early days of the resistance. He had lost friends and comrades to the regime's brutal repression. For him, this mission represented not just military necessity, but personal justice for years of suffering under Mussolini's rule. Audisio arrived at the farmhouse in Bonzanigo with a small team of partisans. The decision had been made at the highest levels of the resistance leadership, and there was no room for debate or delay. The war was still raging. Allied forces were advancing rapidly, and the partisans understood that keeping Mussolini alive posed too many risks and complications. When Audisio entered the room where Mussolini and Petacci were being held, the former dictator seemed to understand immediately what was happening. The partisan commander was direct in his communication, informing Mussolini that he had been condemned to death by the National Liberation Committee for his crimes against the Italian people. Mussolini's reaction was one of shock, followed by a desperate attempt to negotiate. He offered information about hidden fascist gold reserves, promised to reveal the locations of other fleeing officials, and pleaded for his life in terms that would have been unthinkable just days earlier when he still held power. But Audisio was unmoved by these offers. The decision had been made, and there was no appeal process in this improvised court of revolutionary justice. Clara Petacci's fate had also been sealed by association. Despite having no official political role, her presence with Mussolini and her symbolic importance as his companion made her, in the partisan view, complicit in the regime's crimes. Her pleas for mercy fell on ears that had heard too many stories of fascist atrocities to be swayed by appeals to compassion. The preparation for what would happen next was methodical and swift. Audisio and his men loaded their prisoners into a vehicle and began the short journey to a location that would forever be associated with the end of Italian fascism. The drive took only minutes, but it represented the final transition from Mussolini's desperate flight to his ultimate reckoning with the consequences of his actions. As the vehicle wound through the narrow mountain roads near Lake Como, Mussolini sat in silence, perhaps finally understanding that his 23-year hold on power was about to end, not in the grand historical moment he might have envisioned. Clara Petacci's reaction was different. She appeared to be in shock, perhaps still unable to fully comprehend that her association with Mussolini would cost her life. She made several attempts to speak, but Audisio cut short any prolonged farewell or final statements. The partisan commander was focused on completing his mission quickly and efficiently. The execution itself was swift. Audisio raised his weapon and fired multiple shots at close range. Both Mussolini and Petacci fell immediately. And the man who had dominated Italian politics for over 2 decades was dead within seconds. There were no grand final words. No dramatic gestures, no ceremony, just the abrupt end of a life that had shaped the destiny of millions. The partisan commander quickly verified that both were dead, then ordered his men to load the bodies into the vehicle. The plan was to transport them to Milan, where they would be displayed publicly as proof that the fascist regime had finally ended. This decision reflected the partisans' understanding that many Italians would need visual confirmation of Mussolini's death before they would believe that their long nightmare was truly over. As the vehicle departed Giulino di Mezzagra, it left behind only scattered personal effects and bloodstains that would be washed away by the next rain. The site would later be marked with a modest memorial, but at the moment of departure, nothing distinguished it from countless other quiet streets in northern Italy. The journey to Milan would take several hours, during which news of Mussolini's death began to spread through partisan communication networks. By evening, resistance fighters throughout northern Italy knew that Il Duce was dead, though the general population would not learn of his fate until the following morning. What awaited the bodies in Milan would complete the symbolic destruction of Italian fascism in a manner that even the partisans had not fully anticipated. The drive from Giulino di Mezzagra to Milan took place in the fading light of April 28, 1945. Walter Audicio and his partisan team transported the bodies through mountain roads that were still dangerous due to scattered German forces and remaining fascist loyalists. The irony was not lost on the partisans that they were now smuggling the corpse of the man who had once traveled these same roads in armored motorcades, surrounded by cheering crowds. During the journey, Audicio faced a critical decision about how to present Mussolini's death to the Italian public. The partisan leadership understood that simply announcing the dictator's execution might not be sufficient. After 23 years of fascist rule, many Italians had been conditioned to view Mussolini as almost superhuman, a figure whose power seemed unshakable and whose survival instincts had carried him through numerous political crises. The partisans had witnessed this phenomenon throughout the resistance struggle. Even as fascist forces crumbled and German support evaporated, some Italians continued to believe that Mussolini would somehow emerge victorious, or at least escape to fight another day. The myth of Il Duce's invincibility had been carefully cultivated through decades of propaganda, and it would require dramatic proof to finally shatter that illusion. As the vehicle approached Milan, reports reached partisan command that other high-ranking fascist officials had also been captured and executed throughout northern Italy. The entire leadership structure of the Italian Social Republic was collapsing in a matter of hours. This coordinated elimination of fascist leaders represented the final phase of a resistance campaign that had cost thousands of partisan lives over the preceding months. The decision was made to display the bodies publicly in Milan's Piazzale Loreto, a location that held particular significance for the Italian resistance movement. Just months earlier, this same square had been the site of a gruesome display orchestrated by fascist forces. The bodies of 15 executed partisans had been left there as a warning to anyone considering resistance against the regime. The choice of Piazzale Loreto for Mussolini's final exhibition was thus deeply symbolic. The square would witness the reversal of fascist brutality as the bodies of the regime's leaders replaced those of their victims. This transformation of meaning from a site of fascist intimidation to a place of liberation celebration perfectly captured the broader reversal of power that was taking place throughout Italy. As night fell on April 28th, the partisan convoy entered Milan's outskirts. The city was still technically under German occupation, but Wehrmacht forces were in full retreat, and partisan units controlled most neighborhoods. The streets that had once witnessed massive fascist rallies and parades now prepared to host the final scene of Mussolini's story. The stage was set for a public spectacle that would exceed anything the partisans had planned or anticipated. Dawn on April 29, 1945, brought with it scenes in Milan's Piazzale Loreto that would be seared into Italian collective memory for generations. The bodies of Mussolini, Clara Petacci, and other fascist leaders had been arranged in the square during the early morning hours, and word of their display spread rapidly through the city's neighborhoods. What followed was an explosion of public emotion that had been building for over 2 decades. Italians who had lived under fascist repression, who had lost family members to the regime's violence, and who had endured years of war and hardship, finally had a tangible symbol that their suffering was over. The crowds that gathered in Piazzale Loreto represented every segment of Italian society that had opposed or suffered under Mussolini's rule. The scene was chaotic and emotionally charged. People pushed forward to get a closer look at the man who had dominated their lives for so long, many unable to believe that the dictator was truly dead. Some spat on the corpses, others kicked them, and many simply stared in stunned silence at the physical proof that fascism in Italy had finally ended. The display served multiple purposes beyond simple revenge. For the partisan movement, it provided unmistakable evidence that they had succeeded in their primary mission, the elimination of fascist leadership. For ordinary Italians, it offered a form of psychological liberation, allowing them to see with their own eyes that the man they had been taught to fear and revere was nothing more than a mortal human being. The crowd's behavior reflected the complex emotions that Mussolini had inspired throughout his career. Some of those gathered in the square had once cheered him enthusiastically during his rise to power in the 1920s. Others had supported him during Italy's imperial adventures in Ethiopia and the early years of World War II. Now, faced with the consequences of those choices, many experienced a mixture of shame, relief, and vindictive satisfaction. International journalists who witnessed the scene described it as one of the most dramatic endings to any dictatorship in modern history. The images captured that day would be transmitted around the world, providing visual confirmation that another of the Axis powers' leaders had met his end. For Allied forces still fighting in other theaters, the photographs from Piazzale Loreto served as powerful propaganda, demonstrating that victory over fascism was both possible and inevitable. The display continued throughout the morning, with crowds growing larger as news spread. Milan's residents were joined by people from surrounding areas who traveled to the city specifically to witness this historic moment. The square became a pilgrimage site for anyone who had suffered under fascist rule and wanted to see the physical proof of their oppressors' demise. But the public exhibition would not last indefinitely. As the day progressed, both Italian authorities and Allied military commanders began to express concern about the crowds and the potential for the situation to spiral out of control. By late afternoon on April 29, 1945, Allied military authorities intervened to end the public display in Piazzale Loreto. The bodies were removed and eventually buried in unmarked graves, bringing to a close the physical spectacle that had captivated Milan throughout the day. But the impact of those 24 hours between Mussolini's capture and his public exhibition would resonate through Italian society for decades to come. The manner of Mussolini's death became a subject of immediate controversy and would remain so for years afterward. Some argued that the partisan execution represented rough justice, appropriate for a dictator who had shown little mercy to his own victims. Others contended that he should have been captured alive and put on trial, either by Italian courts or international tribunals, to provide a more complete accounting of fascist crimes. The speed with which events unfolded, from his capture on April 27th to his death on April 28th, and public display on April 29th, reflected the chaotic nature of the war's final phase in northern Italy. Partisan commanders made decisions based on immediate military and political necessities rather than longer-term considerations about historical justice or legal precedent. For the Italian resistance movement, Mussolini's elimination represented the successful completion of their primary objective. The partisan networks that had operated in occupied territory for months had proven that even the most entrenched dictatorship could be overthrown by determined popular opposition. The psychological impact of this achievement extended far beyond Italy's borders, inspiring resistance movements in other countries still under fascist occupation. The international reaction to Mussolini's death was mixed, but generally positive among Allied nations. Winston Churchill expressed satisfaction that one of Britain's primary enemies had met his end. American officials viewed it as further evidence that the war in Europe was nearing its conclusion. Soviet leaders praised the partisan action as an example of successful popular resistance against fascism. In Italy itself, Mussolini's death marked the beginning of a difficult process of national reconciliation and reconstruction. The country faced the enormous task of rebuilding not just its physical infrastructure, which had been devastated by years of warfare, but also its political and social institutions, which had been corrupted by decades of authoritarian rule. The legacy of those final 24 hours would influence Italian politics and society for generations. The image of Mussolini's corpse hanging in Piazzale Loreto became a powerful symbol of the consequences of dictatorship and the possibility of popular resistance. It served as both a warning to future would-be dictators and an inspiration to those who might need to oppose them. The location where Mussolini died in Giulino di Mezzagra became a site of historical pilgrimage, though of a very different sort than the fascist monuments that had once dotted Italy. Visitors came not to celebrate the dictator's memory, but to reflect on the lessons of his rise and fall, and to remember the ordinary Italians who had found the courage to resist his regime. The final 24 hours of Benito Mussolini's life encapsulate one of the most dramatic collapses in political history. From his desperate attempt to flee to Switzerland, disguised as a German soldier, through his capture by partisan forces, to his execution and public display in Milan's Piazzale Loreto, these events marked not just the end of a dictator, but the conclusion of an entire era in Italian and European history. The man who had once promised to restore the glory of ancient Rome, who had led Italy into disastrous military adventures and aligned the country with Nazi Germany, met his end in circumstances that stripped away all pretense of grandeur or historical significance. His final hours were characterized not by the dramatic gestures and rhetorical flourishes that had defined his public career, but by fear, desperation, and ultimate helplessness in the face of forces he could no longer control. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like and subscribe to History Saga channel so you never miss more compelling history documentaries. Thank you for watching.